Thank you, Robin. Thank you. Just for the record, I'm not supposed to be here, but I'm here. So, anyway, it's great to see you. General Petraeus, thanks for joining us. Welcome to New Orleans.
Privileged to be back.
The thing that they most want to know about is, have you had a beignet yet?
No, I don't do beignets.
Oh, okay. Well,
with all due respect.
We'll forgive him for that.
Too many carbs or something. Look, thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the very kind introduction. Thanks for not mentioning that I lost out for Time Person of the Year to Vladimir Putin. It's a little sensitive these days. More recently, though, he sanctioned me a couple of years ago, so I'm feeling better about that. Thanks to all of you for being here. You know, it's sort of gratifying for an old soldier to see a standing room only crowd. It was like a flash mob assembled outside there. And to be interviewed by this man right here is really very, very special. You heard why he was so extraordinary. You know, I've often said that he was one of these individuals that was willing to touch the third rail of politics, and he didn't get electrocuted. And the reason was because his reasoning was so thoughtful, it was so patient, careful, and at the end of the day, compelling. And so, Mayor, thanks for what you did back in the day, and thanks actually for what you're doing now, where you're trying to ensure that America's infrastructure is fit for purpose.
So thank you, General.
One other thing, if I could. I want to thank for the warning up front. I actually felt very strongly when we were doing all these wars that we literally were, among other things, fighting for the rights of those back home to express freely their views, including when the MoveOn.org took out a full-page ad attacking me personally in the day of the biggest testimony of my life. And I was asked how I thought about that, and I said, you know, I feel very proud to have, in a way, defended the right of these individuals to criticize me, but not necessarily in a forum where it disrupts. And so I think that's the key distinction here, and I appreciate that up front.
General, thank you. A couple of just introductions. First of all, I want to thank my wife, Cheryl, and Walter Isaacson for this incredible book festival. Give them a round of applause. To all of our sponsors, I think the Rileys are sponsoring this room, so thank you guys so much. And thank all of you for being here today. I do want to just reiterate the point. We're about to talk about a very complicated and giving the timing of this conversation, very emotional topic. So I'm sure people in this room have very strong feelings about it. My respectful request to everybody in the room is to let's be really hard on the problem and soft on the people and see if we can learn the things that we need to learn so that the decisions that we make in the future are in many ways better than the ones that we've made in the past, and sometimes replicate them based on what it is that we've learned. So, General, let me kind of start off where we should start off, which is at the beginning, which would be with Plato. There is a question in the book that somebody asks about, do you think there's a chance that we will ever have everlasting peace? And one of the quotes that's in the book is from Plato, and I'd like to ask you about it simply for this, because we live in a difficult world. There has to be a sense of realism about what we're doing. I don't know exactly how many wars we've had in the history of the world, but in the book you talk about somewhere between 150 and 300 from 1945 till today. So I wanted just to ask you about the inevitability of conflict and whether or not there is ever a chance in the world where we will achieve a just and lasting peace that endures for a long period of time.
I mean, there's a chance, but it's not a very large one. Of course, Plato supposedly said, because it's actually disputed whether he really did say it or not, that only the dead have seen the end of war, and tragically I fear that that is the case. And I occasionally note that, you know, you have to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be. And tragically, there are too many factors in the world that still bring about conflict, whether it's individual leaders, the clash of forces, and so forth, civil wars, insurgencies, extremists, it's all out there. The key, of course, is to deter as much of that as you possibly can. Deterrence rests on two elements. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other. And we have to make sure that there's never any doubt about those two elements. And we'll return to that, because one of the other points we make in the book is that what happens in one part of the world reverberates in others. I was actually in Southeast Asia when the red line in Syria turned out not to be a red line, and the prime minister of a very important partner out there said, you know, General, that stuff reverberates out here and in the South China Sea and in other places. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, frankly, which was not necessary. Yes, it's a long war, and I guess theoretically we should end long wars, but we've had tens of thousands of troops deployed in various places around the world since the end of World War II. Korea, another example of this. Yes, it was an active war zone, but we hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months,
right.
And not because of the agreement with the Taliban that I found so, frankly,
Well, I want to talk about that in detail more
Yep.
later, but I wanted to ask you just out front, why did you decide, well, let me back up for a minute. When you heard the general's resume, which is long and distinguished, from 1990, I suppose, until recently, in a formal capacity, as a warrior with boots on the ground, or as a thinker, at Princeton, you have, for the most part, been involved in some form or fashion in every conflict that the United States has had from that point forward. I'm not sure that's your starting point, but clearly for the last 23 years,
Sure.
or 33 years, I guess, you've been involved in all of that.
Yep.
So you're a person who should know, or at least have developed some
Yep.
theories about how the life works, right?
Well, look, Andrew Roberts called up. I knew Andrew really well. We'd done a lot of events together over the years. I think I interviewed him 5 times alone on his Churchill book at the New York Historical Society. It was so much fun. We just kept doing it again and again. And he said, the Russians have just invaded Ukraine, and there's no book out there that provides the military historical context for that. Would you be interested in doing it? And I jumped at the chance, number one, because I have enormous respect for him. He's truly an extraordinary scholar, historian, biographer. But number two, I'd actually been looking for an opportunity, a vehicle, if you will, to actually capture the history of the 2 wars that I was privileged to command. I mean, one of which I was in almost nonstop for nearly a decade, Iraq, and the other, of course, off and on. And then also to revisit Vietnam, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation at Princeton, knowing that there were 3 or 4 decades since I'd actually addressed it, and there had been a lot more scholarship, memoirs, and declassification of papers. I also wanted to do something that, you're about to ask what was the big takeaway that people should take, and I'll just go ahead and lay it out here. I developed an intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership, leadership at the very top of an endeavor, and I think it really works. And I wanted to lay that out in the introduction, and we would then look at the quality of strategic leadership in each of the conflicts that we visited in the book. And perhaps not surprisingly, the side that had the best strategic leadership typically prevailed. Not always. Sometimes the objective conditions are so difficult, such as, for example, in Ukraine, where even though President Zelensky has been an exemplary strategic leader, he's facing a country that has 3 to 4 times its population and 10 times the size of the economy, is unconcerned with casualties and all the rest of that, and has a grip on the population. But nonetheless, this has 4 tasks. You have to get the big ideas right. You have to craft the right strategy. In the case of conflict, you have to understand your forces, the enemy forces, the physical terrain, the human terrain, the neighborhood, all of that, and get the big ideas right. You then have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of your organization so they understand what they're going to execute, but also to everyone else who has a stake in the outcome of the conflict. You then have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the example the leader provides, the energy, the inspiration, attracting great people and keeping them, letting those not measuring up move on. The metrics, and they have to be really hard and fast. It can't be the body count in Vietnam, which is both the wrong metric and then became dishonest over time as well. You have to get the organizational architecture right. There's no template handed to you for that. You have to work it. Everyone is unique. And you also have to have a battle rhythm. How do you use your time, which is the most important element of executing, because you drive the execution of a campaign plan literally through the meetings you conduct, the visits you make with troops, going on patrol with them to get a feel for it yourself, all of the interaction that you have with all of these stakeholders and so forth. And on that battle rhythm are events that enable, or in some cases force you, to perform the 4th task, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas as the reality evolves, as the context changes, as you achieve success or experience setbacks, so that you can do it again and again and again. This really does work, and we'll go through this a little bit, I'm sure, as we go forward. But I also want to just lay out how it works in the civilian world, in the private sector, because I've been in that. I've learned that the highest calling in government after government service is actually the private equity industry. That's a joke. Thank you. Work with me. So I've looked at Netflix and Reed Hastings. I think he's one of the great strategic leaders of our time, right up there with Jack Ma of Alibaba, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and so forth. Took something from very small to very big. 4 transformations very quickly. First big idea, we're going to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar, and thereby put Blockbuster out of business. There's one Blockbuster left in the U.S., by the way, now. Bend, Oregon, famously contrarian place, will not let its Blockbuster die. Those of my generation in here now can take our grandkids there to show them what we did on Friday nights. So anyway, he works that big idea. That goes great. Again, Blockbuster's going out of business, but others are doing what he's doing. He says now the context has changed. Broadband speeds have accelerated so much we can have people download content. That's the new big idea. Third big idea is we're going to make our own content. $100 million of House of Cards alone, all the other iconic series that we know and binged on during the early months of COVID in particular. And then the fourth big idea, we're going to make major motion pictures. We're going to go head-to-head with the major studios. In fact, we're going to buy 2 of them, not just one. And they do that so well that a few years later, they got more Academy Award nominations than any other major motion picture studio. There was one issue, and I did address this with him. I've talked about this model with him. He has something very similar. I did say that, that movie in which Brad Pitt played General McChrystal, my very long combat comrade, just didn't work. Stan McChrystal doesn't march around like a little toy soldier and salute stiffly and has no sense of humor. I said it just does not work, but beyond that, I could not believe that Brad Pitt did not hold out to play me.
I have the same problem. All right, that's in the book. If you haven't had a chance to read it, this is set out very, very early about strategic leadership, which is critically important in the civil world.
It's a deciding factor in most cases.
Yeah, and there are different words and different languages for it, and it is an application. But as Winston Churchill so famously said, even the best laid plans, and I'm paraphrasing, they're going to be unanticipated consequences. Human interaction is really problematic. Yep. War, as you know, turns on the dime in a minute. And so I wonder
Everybody
why,
has a plan until he gets punched in the face.
Yeah, that would be Mike Tyson and Winston Churchill. You would only see that with Petraeus and Landrieu, Tyson and Churchill in the same sentence. Why did you pick these particular conflicts to analyze? Because there were a lot. Because is my number right that between 1945 and today there are approximately 300 conflicts?
Yeah, and we obviously couldn't cover all that number. Yeah. So we tried to identify those that were the most important in the evolution of warfare, essentially. Right. So that's what it is about, after all. We're trying to understand that. And then, in particular, we look at what was the quality of the strategic leadership. Because you look at the French at Dien Bien Phu, what a horrible big idea. We're frustrated. The guerrillas won't fight us. So let's create a huge base that's way out into the countryside, a valley surrounded by hills, and we assume that the not Viet Cong at that time, the Viet Minh, will not be able to get their artillery on the hills. They actually do. They take them apart piece by piece and do that. You're going to be dependent on an airfield because we're way out beyond what the vehicles could get to, and they're at the edge of the air envelope as well. And frankly, terrible, terrible big idea. The Viet Minh came to fight, and they defeated them. Frankly, the U.S. in Vietnam, 13 years it took us to actually get the right strategy. The South Vietnamese, of course, they're partitioned, north and south, right after the French left and they had the agreement in Geneva. And the South Vietnamese came to the new American advisor and said, we need help with security in the hamlets and the provinces and the villages. And we said, no, we'll tell you what you need. We're fresh from the battlefields of Korea, where they have a north and a south. What you need are 7 or 8 divisions, 15,000 troops each, to hold off the invasion by the north from the south. Well, that couldn't have been more wrong at that time and for about the next 15 years. And so instead of focusing on security of the people, we focused on going after this elusive enemy out in the jungle with big units and using fairly indiscriminate air power, a lot of artillery, often unobserved, mad minutes, and the rest of that. And so for all of the courage, the valor, the initiative, the drive of our soldiers on the ground, who, by the way, served their country, these weren't volunteers like I was privileged to lead in combat. They went because the country told them to, and they did do it. But the leadership failed them. And it wasn't until late 1968, that you finally had a recognition that what we need to do is focus on security of the people instead of thrashing around in the jungle. We'd win these battles. I went back and reread some books that I'd read earlier, but with a different mindset. We Were Soldiers Once and Young, for example, written by Lieutenant General retired Hal Moore, is about when he was a battalion commander of an air assault unit. That's what I was commanding at the time the book came out. I was looking at it for the tactics, the techniques, the courage, the leadership, all of this. This time I went back and looked at his reflections. And boy, I'd missed that the first time, but I wasn't looking for that kind of thing then. And he writes, you know, the Battle of the Idrang, that was the first really big fight, 1965, 1st Cavalry Division's on the ground. He said that was seen by General Westmoreland as a huge success, that we killed 10 of the enemy for every one of us, but they still lost several dozen, many dozens of American soldiers just in his own battalion. And he said, you know, General Westmoreland may have thought that was a good exchange ratio, but I'm not sure America's mothers and fathers agreed. And wow. And then he discussed later as a brigade commander where they win an even bigger battle, and then they hand it off to locals, and the enemy is back within 2 or 3 weeks. So again, they hadn't thought through how to do this. What it needed to have been was a comprehensive civil-military counterinsurgency campaign instead of a war of attrition with search and destroy tactics that we could not win against an enemy who could continue to generate forces.
Well, thank you for that. Just as a point to not be overstated, our military right now is volunteer.
Very much so.
Actually show up
Yep.
and volunteer and thank them for their service.
Absolutely.
But they're only about, what's the percentage of Americans that serve in the military?
It's usually less than 2% at a given time. And so again, it's a very special group of people. I believe that, in fact, those that I was privileged to command in the post 9/11 wars should be acknowledged as America's new greatest generation. They literally raised their hand, took an oath to serve our country in uniform at a time of war, and to re-enlist repeatedly as well, I might add. I oversaw the largest re-enlistment ceremony in history, and it was in Baghdad, of all places, in the second year of the surge, 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. It wasn't for the stock options. It was because of the privilege that they felt. They didn't beat their chest about it, but they felt a privilege to serve our country and to perform a mission larger than self, to do it with others who felt the same way, and also, frankly, to appreciate that Americans did thank them for their service, even if they disagreed with the policies that we were executing. And that was a very, very special element of that. By the way, the generation that did the most to ensure that our soldiers got welcomed home properly was the Vietnam veterans. By the way, if there are Vietnam veterans in this room, could you stand up, please? Please.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a great chapter in the book about Vietnam, and I would commend it to you. I want to jump to 1990 to 2005, 2006,
Sure.
and talk about Iraq 1, Iraq
Yep.
2, Afghanistan. You can do it, obviously, in whatever
Sure.
order you want. But you were involved in all three of those conflicts. In the first one, you were a youngster. You got a little bit older over time, and your command got a little bit higher, and you got more stars, and you understood, and people listened to you, even though you were yelling from the back of the room sometime about what's next. And so will you kind of just take us through that iteration and what we didn't learn from Iraq 1 that we may have repeated in Iraq 2 and in Afghanistan that then produced what I think you coined, I'll give this to you, but you can give it to Odierno or whoever you want to, about the counterinsurgency strategy that seems to permeate a lot of your thinking.
Yep.
Is that a fair assessment?
We wrote it. I was essentially the editor-in-chief.
Yep.
Between the 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq. And so in 2006, I finally had a tour where I wasn't in combat. I was in Bosnia as 1-star, then Iraq 2-star, 3-star, and then had a 15-month period, and oversaw the organization that had all of the Army's schools, centers, training centers, doctrine center, leadership center, staff college, all this. We called it the engine of change for our Army. And I recognized that there were a lot of issues that we needed to distill lessons and then incorporate them. And the way to do that, first and foremost, was to actually have a doctrinal manual that actually gave us the intellectual foundation for what it was we were seeking to do, which we did not have. After Vietnam, we basically consigned counterinsurgency to the ash heap of history. We never wanted to do it again, and we forgot one of the old adages, which is that you don't get to choose the wars you fight. Somebody else does that for you. So that was a very important development that we went through. And first of all, if you go back to Desert Storm, completely different war. I mean, this was sent from central casting for the U.S. Army in particular. You know, out in the desert, there's no civilians on the battlefield except when you get into Kuwait City. We could just mass forces. We could pound the enemy for 43 nights from the air, 43 days from the air, and then run over them in a 100-hour war that showed the extraordinary development, in particular of the U.S. military, but also some of our coalition forces. I remember I was actually the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army at the time, and we built a force that could defeat them and then literally doubled it. There was going to be no doubt about this. It didn't matter that we did a left hook or anything. You could have gone right through them, candidly, although the leadership by George H.W. Bush, fundamental decision, this will not stand in the very first National Security Council meeting, when the military is pretty ambivalent about that. Keep in mind, we had no troops on the ground in Saudi Arabia and these other places, and it wasn't certain that we could do all this, but he says this will not stand. That's the decision. Got it. And military takes orders. Then you have a great combination of General Powell as the chairman and General Schwarzkopf as the theater, the battlefield commander, if you will, and build this extraordinary force and then carry out an incredible campaign. The invasion of Iraq, very, very different. Yes, the initial piece, I was a two-star division commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division. And I remember asking down in Kuwait, we had the final meeting of the commanders, and they said, any questions? I said, yeah, excuse me, could you just give us a little bit more detail about what happens after we get to Baghdad and take down the regime?
This is the second Iraq War.
This is the second Iraq War. So this is 2003.
President Bush the son.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the retired three-star that was heading this organization that was going to do the Organization for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, he said, he knew me and I knew him, said, Dave, you just get us to Baghdad, we'll take it from there. That didn't work out, obviously. Really a very impressive campaign to defeat the Iraqi army, to topple the regime and so forth. But then we also were far too light. We had far too few forces. So we'd overlearned the lessons of Afghanistan. Secretary Rumsfeld whittled the plan way down from where it was prior to that. I'd been involved in that as a one-star as well. And so all of a sudden, basically, we owned it. I remember we took the first major city in Iraq, about 400,000 people, the holiest city in Shia Islam, Najaf. And I called my boss and I said, hey, boss, I got good news and bad news. Good news is we own Najaf. What's the bad news? We own Najaf. What do you want us to do with it? He said, call those guys from Orhat. Tell them, let's do a little trial here, see how it worked. Didn't even answer the phone initially, and then finally said, no, we're still getting organized. And then we had some seriously bad big ideas. So Orha gets fired, the Coalition for Provisional Authority is established, they bring in someone who I don't think had ever set foot in Iraq, very bright guy, but not with the nuanced understanding, and the very first thing he does is signs two orders. The first one fires the entire Iraqi military without telling them how we're going to enable them to provide for their families. So you've created hundreds of thousands, many hundreds of thousands of individuals who are trained and armed to oppose the new Iraq rather than support that. That's not a good idea. In fact, we had a sign on the wall in all of my ops centers as a 2, 3, 4, 4, 4 star in combat that asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that is no, you don't conduct that operation until you can get to yes. So that violated that big time. And then he fired the Ba'ath Party down to level 4, which included tens of thousands of bureaucrats that we needed to run a country we didn't sufficiently understand and did not have a reconciliation process in it. So again, they're literally cast out of life. Now, I was given a bit of authority and then I exercised a bit more. So we ran a reconciliation process up in Mosul, which is where I ended up. And it solved all these problems for about 6 or 8 months until I left, and then the Iraqis that were running the thing quashed it all. So at that case, we had, and then we ran the whole thing with a pickup team that rotating every 3 months, the civilians, instead of establishing an embassy, which we should have done right at the outset. So a lot of challenges. Then we got it sorted out. New commander comes in, gets the organizational architecture right, strategy right, but it's invalidated in 2006 by an event that sets off a cycle of Sunni Shia violence, that there's reluctance to change what they were doing, which by then was handing off to the Iraqis leaving the neighborhoods and going home. And then I was brought in to command the surge. The situation was out of control. We were in the early stages of a Sunni-Shia civil war, and we decided we're going to completely reverse what we're doing. By the way, there's all these books about change leadership. You can't change more than 180 degrees, which is what we did. And I had to do it over the objections of the Prime Minister of Iraq. But we were convinced that we had to go back into the neighborhoods. You have to live with the people in order to secure them. That's job one. We're going to take back control from the Iraqi security forces. We are going to create reconciliation, because you can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency. And we're going to pursue the irreconcilables, al-Qaeda and the other elements, even more relentlessly than we were before, because they had to be destroyed. And that turned it around. It drove violence down by nearly 90%, gave 3.5 great years, until unfortunately our combat forces left and the Iraqi Prime Minister undid it. That set the stage for the Islamic State, and we had to go in and help them deal with that as well.
Well, first of all, thank you for that. And I just want to highlight just a couple of things that the General went through really quickly. In Fallujah, right, and in Najaf, the two cities that were the holy cities, you actually went back in there with American money, by the way, and help rebuild those communities.
You have to do that.
And that you needed to knit together and understand the culture and the people, because you cannot, I think this is what you just said, you can't overpower by military might basically an ideology or another thing. And I'm interested because when I was reading that, and I'm not trying to demote you, but you would have been a great mayor.
But hey, let me tell you
really
something.
Been a great mayor.
Let me say, so people would come up to Mosul and say, General, who's your inspiration for this? Is it MacArthur? I said, are you kidding me? I thought at the time, is a different time, but I said, this is more, I'm thinking like the mayor of New York City, the broken window strategy, which turns into the crack house, and so you got to stop it early. It's like being a mayor. By the way, when that first year, I had the authority by the Geneva Convention, I was an occupying power commander. So I controlled the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. But what I did is we ran the first election in Iraq literally 2 weeks after I got to Mosul, because I needed local partners who actually knew something about this province to which we'd been sent. By the way, we didn't even have maps for it. We weren't supposed to go to Mosul. We were supposed to stay in the Baghdad area. So no, you think, and there are three elements to counterinsurgency. You clear an area of the enemy. You then hold it. And again, create gated communities, however you do it, biometric ID cards, there's a lot of tactics, techniques, and procedures. And then you hold it, and then you rebuild it. And by the way, this is what I think the Israeli Defense Forces need to add in addition to the tasks that they're taking. I was just there last week for several days. I met with the Minister of Defense at his request, discussed how we did that, and then talked subsequently with him again. And actually yesterday, I believe, there was an announcement they're going to flood the part that they've cleared with humanitarian assistance. In the rest of this, that's a very, very positive move. And again, as the operation continues, and I do think that the Houthis are extremists that cannot be reconciled. They're irreconcilable. It's certainly the bulk that you therefore have to continue the operation. And I know that's a very, very difficult, but how you do it, how you do that matters. And if they go into Rafah, and there's an announcement that they plan to do that, you've got to get the civilians out of the way very, very effectively. And because of the biometric capabilities that they have, the extremists on 10/7 photographed and videoed everything, these barbaric and horrific actions, and they have that, and they're mining that, and that's how you can pick out, because they're wearing civilian clothes, who the extremists are, who the Houthis are, and who the general population is. But again, you have to separate the people from the enemy, and you have to keep them separated with these various tactics, techniques, and procedures, and that's what they're grappling with.
Well, of course, I mean, to play the devil's advocate, the biggest complaint has been that Israel, for all of its intention and all of its right, is not doing a good enough job of thinking about protecting civilians in the region where Hamas is using them as shields, and that they could do a better job of that. The counterinsurgency strategy that you laid out actually says you got to do that or you can't succeed, right?
I think there is a very, very substantially increased recognition of this. And again, we'll see how it plays out as they proceed further south. But as Benny Gantz, who's a longtime friend of mine, former chief of staff there and then Minister of Defense, said the other day, you don't tell the fire department to extinguish 80% of the blaze. You actually have to take it all on. But how you do it is really, really important. And how you do it should have that sign staring you in the face as you contemplate each operation that is brought to you as a commander.
Yeah, you know, one of the things you talk about in the book is intelligence. And of course, on October 7th, Israel, I guess generally before that was known as having one of the greatest intelligence capabilities in the world, missed it in some form or fashion. Yes. And it's an old lesson that somehow is forgotten throughout all wars. And I think you actually talk about that in each one of the examples. So when we...
Let me talk briefly about that very quickly. This is not just an intelligence failure. It was also a military readiness failure, and it was a political failure. Because at the very top, there was an assessment that they shared that they had been co-opting Hamas. They've been giving them more of the worker visas. They've been allowing the Qatari money to go into Gaza, all of these different actions. And frankly, Hamas really fed disinformation in that regard to them. I think that, keeping in mind that, by the way, this is the province of Shin Bet, or Shabak as it's called now, the internal security service, not Mossad. They deal with the West Bank and Gaza. But Gaza is just about a denied area. So it's very, very difficult to do anything with human sources in there. You have to rely on a lot of technology. And I think that the Hamas started to figure out what are the sources and methods the Israelis are using about us, and then fed disinformation into those or shut them down. They created their own little phone system, in fact, running field wire through the tunnels. You're getting 350 miles worth of tunnels. And that was one of the reasons that the intelligence failed to pick this up, although I think when the inquiry is conducted, they're going to find out, my understanding is that there were some individuals that did literally have the plan, they believed, and it was very close to what was executed. But then there was, at a certain level, disbelief. It's the same thing that afflicted us prior to 9/11. We lacked the imagination that someone could actually do on 9/11 what they did, and the same was true of 10/7. But then, unfortunately, the military readiness was very degraded. It was a Shabbat, and it was a special religious holiday on top. There were a lot on leave. They'd refocused much more on the West Bank than on Gaza, thinking again that Hamas was becoming a, quote, responsible stakeholder, and obviously they were wrong. And that's why you had such a lag in the response that was so egregious as well.
So don't you think that somewhere in one of the back rooms where the smart people are thinking about this war, there's a young David Petraeus who's saying to Benny Gantz and to Bibi, looking at the current condition of Gaza, well, what's next? And how are we going to get there? And do you think that they have given a tremendous amount of thought to that in the context of this much larger world conflict and the relationship between the United States and Israel?
They have. The problem is there's not consensus. Now, keep in mind, let me back up a little bit now and just sketch something out. Number one is it's really hard to appreciate how traumatic this was for all of Israeli society. Everybody knows someone who was killed, and the families are all in service and so forth. This was the equivalent, in our terms, of 42,000 being killed and 7,000 being taken hostage. Keep in mind there's not quite 3,000 that were killed on 9/11. So again, the trauma is unbelievable. And there is a challenge, frankly, of distinguishing between Hamas and the Palestinians in the West Bank. And
they are separate and distinct.
Very much so, yeah. It's not to say that there's not affinity. There's considerable support for Hamas. And this is not one where they're going to welcome being liberated from Hamas. But over time, hearts and minds still matter, and there has to be attention to that. I know that they are grappling with what comes next, and the problem is they don't want to have to occupy Gaza, and we're telling them don't occupy, but then tell me who else can actually do what it is that I've laid out. You can actually work your way through this. Believe it or not, you can get local contractors. You can get some from outside. My understanding is there's very substantial money in the West Bank, and one individual in particular that will fund some of this. The Emiratis can help in some way, but they've got to cobble that together very quickly, because in the meantime, because they're not holding these areas as adequately as they should, you can see Hamas reconstituting. You can see them re-infiltrating. You can feel this. There's so much open source intelligence out there now that if you really marinate in it, and I try to understand it, you can actually develop a feel, I think, that's almost as good as what we had, when we were actually engaged in something personally.
But you mentioned when you were talking about the mistakes that we made in Afghanistan, one of the rules is if what you're doing militarily is creating more, I don't know if you use the word terrorist,
bad
then
guys.
Protecting citizens, when do you get to that point, if we haven't gotten there already, we being the collective we, the world, in Gaza and Israel?
Well, first of all, let me talk quickly about Afghanistan, because I really should mention that. When I was asked to go to Afghanistan as a 3-star on the way home from my 3-star tour in Iraq, Rumsfeld just kept sort of calling my number. Your reward for him for doing something is you get to do something else. And I pointed out that was not the most direct route home, but I said, okay, fine. So we took a team, went over there, and I came back, and I laid out a slide for him, the bottom line of which was Afghanistan is going to be the longest of the long wars, even though the level of violence is maybe 1/3, 1/4 of what Iraq is right now. This is 2005. And I laid out a compare and contrast. And in every situation, Afghanistan was tougher. Afghanistan had no money. Iraq could have a lot of money if you can get the oil pumping again. We did during the surge. Afghanistan has no infrastructure. Iraq had a lot. No education. Iraq had comparably a lot. Terrain, the Hindu Kush, there's some formidable mountains. There was nothing comparable in Iraq. And then the biggest issue is that in Afghanistan, the enemy had sanctuary outside the country, in the neighboring country, and that neighboring country not only would not do anything about it, Pakistan, they wouldn't allow us to do much about it either. And that was really crippling deficiency. And so you had to recognize all of this. Afghanistan was not Iraq. What we did in Iraq in some ways might inform what we do over there, but the situation is so different that you have to adapt considerably. And that's one of the challenges especially for a coalition commander, because we had a very substantial, I think, 50, 60 different countries worth of troops.
All right, I'm going to ask you to do something that's impossible because we have about 6 minutes and 30 seconds left, so I'm going to take my last 3 questions and put them into one and just let you finish off for us. I'd like you to talk to Ukraine, talk about Ukraine with us a little bit, what the current state of that is, what we need to do, the importance of NATO, just kind of that subject matter. And then I want you to answer, if you can, because I assume you wrote this book to help us learn the lessons of the past and to be able to see as much as we can into the future and what this portends for China and Taiwan and that area of the world, and then what the future of war looks like, which is pretty much the end of your book.
Okay,
so
got it.
Hit that and throw a little technology in there if you don't mind. And you got 5 minutes and 46 seconds, so go. And that's not a hard question. He can do it.
Not at all. Not at all. I'll talk about dikes as well.
He can do it,
around
sure.
New Orleans and this kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Look, so I just did a piece, in fact, for Foreign Policy. It was essentially asked, whither whither Ukraine? And the answer was, it depends. And I said that not just because I taught economics in an earlier life, and the answer to every question is, it depends. It's because it really does. First and foremost, on U.S. assistance coming through, I'm hopeful the House will finally address this. Look, this war is about as black versus white as it can possibly get, right versus wrong. I mean, this is crucial. This is an unprovoked, brutal invasion of a neighboring country by a kleptocrat with a twisted, grievance-filled, revanchist, revisionist view of history that denies their, otherwise a great guy, and besides, he beat me out for Time Man of the Year. But it denies their very existence, because they're threatening. If Ukraine truly blossomed into this vibrant, democratic, free market capitalist system, all the Russians would look at that and say, why not us?
Yeah.
So again, he's taken that action. This is the first invasion of a sovereign country in Europe since World War II. It cannot stand, and we should be doing everything that we can to support them. I agree. And I say, I'm non-political, by the way. I don't even register to vote. I stopped when I was promoted to 2 stars. So that's not any political. And I think the administration actually did a very good job in responding and leading the West, but subsequently has delayed far too long on critical decisions that denied the Ukrainians the systems, the weapon systems, aircraft, and other munitions that they should have had for the counteroffensive last summer, for example. So it also depends, though, there's a crucial issue that Ukraine has to solve for itself. The way they conscript, the way they recruit soldiers is dramatically different from others. The average age of the soldiers I was privileged to lead in Iraq and Afghanistan was 18 to 21 or 23. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier in the front lines is 42. They have to come to grips with this. So they want them to get an education, get married, start a family, and then they start to bring them into service. And it's so emotional. This is a third rail of politics issue for President Zelensky, but they have to resolve this because forced generation, as the war stretches out like this, has to be addressed. And again, Russia has a lot of advantages in that regard. Then there's a variety of other issues. Will the Europeans continue? By the way, the Europeans are strong on this. I was at Munich Security Conference this year. It's the exact opposite of what it normally is. The Americans are purposeful and beating up on the Europeans for not doing what they should do. This year, the Europeans are doing what they should do, and the Americans are somewhat feckless. And so we need to come to grips with that. Now, you asked, is there any relation between this and China? Yes, there is. Remember, the elements of deterrence are potential adversaries' assessment of your capabilities on one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other. If we can't even continue to support a country that largely shares our values and was invaded in such a manner, what does that do for deterrence out in the Indo-Pacific? There are people that say we should be doing everything for the Indo-Pacific. Well, you're undermining deterrence out there if that is the case. And we have to be conscious of that. Remember what I said earlier, what happens in one part of the world reverberates, has implications in others. And then finally, the future of war, it is being transformed right now. We're not seeing it all that obviously yet, but it is taking place. The bottom line is that major war, major combat, is going to change from being fought by what might be termed platforms, very platform-centric, some of them very, very large, heavily manned, incredibly expensive, and incredibly capable. Aircraft carriers be perfect, but also F-35s, main battle tanks, you name it. From that world, from a small number of very large platforms to a massive number of small systems, unmanned, and in many cases increasingly not even remotely piloted, but actually algorithmically driven. Where the human in the loop, yeah, it's scary. I got it. I agree with you. There are ethical challenges here without question. But the human in the loop becomes the human on the loop, the human who actually determines what is the task for this particular machine or tasks, what are the instructions to it, and then they code it. And by the way, it'll be enabled by AI, so it's going to constantly be upgraded and all the rest of that. But at the end of the day, the machine is going to be given an opportunity at some point when it lines up all the conditions that have to be met to take either kinetic or non-kinetic action. That is actually where this is all heading. We can see it to some degree already. By the way, one of the successes of the Ukrainians, having not achieved it on the ground last summer, has been out in the Black Sea. And in the Black Sea, what you see are such effective unmanned systems, both surface and air, to identify the Russian Black Sea Fleet that they have taken out about 1/3 of the Black Sea Fleet, which cannot be replaced because they have to go through the Bosphorus, and the Montreux Convention forbids warships going through the Bosphorus at a time of war, and Turkey ensures that countries adhere to that. That's a very significant development. They had to pull the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of the port of Sevastopol in occupied Crimea. That is also, though, the future of warfare.
I told y'all he could do it. He did good, huh? So, General, we're at the end. I told you we started at the beginning with Plato, and we're going to end with the last paragraph in the book. Said the biggest idea of all is to stay out of the conflict to begin with, and that leadership matters. So, General, thank you for everything.
Thank you,
It's
Mr.
great
Mayor.
to see you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely.